Throughout our time on this channel, we have covered a vast amount of shipwrecks and shipwreck stories. Many of these stories in fact included stories of ships being refloated, even if later on they would eventually sink yet again. On today's episode, I'm going to cover a brief history on how ships across the Great Lakes were refloated and raised. But before we can talk about how they were raised, we first have to talk about the diving suit. Let's begin. The invention of the diving suit, or diving dress, can be accredited to multiple people throughout history. This would date back as far as 1405, when Conrad Kaiser would describe his design of a diving dress. This would be made with a leather jacket and a metal helmet which had two glass windows on it. The jacket and the helmet were then lined by a sponge to retain the air within it, and then a leather pipe was connected to a bag of air. John Lethbridge would be accredited to creating an early enclosed diving dress as well in the 1710s. And then Augustus Seabay would also develop the standard diving dress with a helmet in the 1830s. In the 1860s, the Great Lakes led to a commercial shipping boom all across them. This would also lead to a commerce and increase in the number of shipwrecks as well that would happen across the Great Lakes. Diving equipment would become essential for salvaging valuable cargo from these shipwrecks across the Great Lakes. And the first modern diving suits that were used across them started showing up in the 1880s. Shipwrecks would become so numerous across the Great Lakes during this commercial boom that divers were needed for even more extensive underwater exploration. In 1917, diver Benjamin F. Leavitt used a completely self-contained and hard-hatted diving suit of his own design to salvage over 350 tons of copper ore from the SS Pewabic. This was a shipwreck in Lake Huron. It also had between 40 to 125 lives that were lost aboard the Pewabic when she sank in Lake Huron. When a shipwreck would occur on the Great Lakes and then would be deemed worthy of salvaging and raising, a diver would be sent. This would happen primarily in the 1880s, the 19th and early 20th centuries. Divers would perform very physically hard work by rigging these sunken vessels for lift operations, and they would do this by diving and walking on the lake bottom. It's also worth noting here that walking on the Great Lakes bottom is a lot more stable than a typical ocean floor. These divers in the well-known hard-hatted diving suits would be lowered from a salvage barge and a winch. This would be done by using a hoist line and an umbilical cord that would supply the air and communication from the surface to the diver on the bottom. The diver's heavy suit and weighted boots allowed them to walk upright on the bottom of the lake. Once the diver was at the wreck site, the diver's primary job was then to prepare the ship for lifting to the surface. This would then involve patching holes in the hull with wooden planks and other materials that the diver had. Divers would also carry tools in a pouch that they had attached to them as they were lowered to the bottom of the lake bed. Once the cables were securely attached to the shipwreck on the bottom of the lake, the crews on the surface would then fill the pontoons or camels, which were specialized buoyancy vessels, with air. Air would also be pumped directly into the sunken vessel's patched up compartments and hull to also give additional buoyancy. Divers had to work very carefully to control their own buoyancy by venting air from their suits, because too much air could cause rapid and dangerous ascent to the surface, as the vessel herself would also be raised. The multiple combination of lift from the pontoons on the surface, along with the air inside the sunken shipwreck, would slowly bring the vessel to the surface. Once the vessel reached the surface, it would be refloated, The ship could also be pumped out with pumps and then returned to service or taken to a scrapyard. The method of raising and refloating shipwrecks on the Great Lakes was actually a very successful and worthwhile endeavor. This being because shipwrecks in the Great Lakes were in a freshwater environment. The fresh water in the Great Lakes would also preserve shipwrecks far better than salt water would do out in the open seas and oceans. Many of the vessels that sank in the Great Lakes were in depths that hard hat divers could safely and efficiently work in to raise them. And unlike the shifting sands of the ocean floor, the Great Lakes bed would actually provide a pretty good firm foundation for these hard-headed divers to walk on while they worked on raising the vessels. A very notable and quite monumental example of a ship being raised on the Great Lakes would undoubtedly be the George M. Humphrey. The Humphrey was the first 600-footer to sink in Great Lakes history. She would be raised in the late summer of 1944 by Captain John Rowan of Sturgeon Bay, Wisconsin. Captain Rowan and his salvaging crew would begin work on raising the Humphrey on October 20th. With his two barges, the Maitland and Industry would first begin with cranes and clamshells by bringing to the surface 8,000 tons of the 13,992 gross tons of iron ore aboard the Humphrey when she sank. After this, divers would then begin removing parts and equipment from the Humphrey as well. The George M. Humphrey was finally brought to the surface in August of 1944. This was just over a year after her sinking in the collision with the steamer D.M. Clemson that brought her down to the bottom in the Straits of Mackinac in 77 feet of water. The raising of the Humphrey was considered a huge success, and Captain John Rowan, who had used air to partially fill the ship's ballast tanks, and then with his two barges lifting her to the surface, considered it also a great success. The complete raising of the George M. Humphrey and all the details and events that went into her raising can be found with other sources and sites online. It wouldn't be right in ending this video without also mentioning the late great Phil Newton. Phil was a pioneer when it came to inventing underwater equipment for commercial, scientific, and also military purposes for his inventions. Phil would go on to invent the newt suit. His newt suit would help in the cutting of the bell off of the Edmund Fitzgerald at the bottom of Lake Superior in 1995. The removing of the bell from the Edmund Fitzgerald was a request from family members who could have something tangible to remember their loved ones by. The bell now sits in the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum to honor the 29 men who went down with the Edmund Fitzgerald on the night of November 10th, 1975. And with that, I now bring to a close this video and episode on Songs of the Great Lakes, in a brief history of how Great Lakes ships were raised from the bottom of the lakes. I thank you all very kindly in staying with me this far. Again, as always, God bless you all, and look forward to the next episode.